If you agree with honoring the stories people carry long after the world stops listening, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Because this one begins in a room that smelled of old paper and endings, where a man everyone believed had lived too quietly to matter died, with a secret heavy enough to tilt the air. They said he spent his final years muttering about the girl who would finish what he couldn't, and when the staff finally unlocked the dust-covered wooden case beside his bed, more out of boredom than respect, they found medals no one recognized and a letter bearing the inked signature of a general whose name still carried weight in certain circles. And that discovery, though none of them knew it then, was the spark that would travel 50 years forward to collide with a young woman who thought she was just another scout candidate fighting to be taken seriously. Harper Lane, 27, American, pale-skinned with ash-blonde hair braided tight as a wire, didn't know her life had already been written into a stranger's final confession. And on the morning everything shifted, she was standing at parade rest on the training field. Pretending not to hear the snickers behind her about the tattoo she kept hidden beneath her sleeve, the one she'd gotten not for style or rebellion, but because her older brother, Nathan Lane of SEAL Team 8, had pressed his calloused hand over her arm and said, "You've earned this more than you know." Before disappearing into an operation he still couldn't talk about, Harper moved through the world like someone accustomed to being underestimated, quiet enough to be mistaken for timid and small enough to be misjudged by anyone who equated size with strength. And though she could outpace nearly every trainee, map terrain in her head with uncanny precision, and spot movement at distances that made instructors double-check their optics, the whispers lingered like static that she wasn't tough enough, wasn't built for field work, wasn't anything more than a legacy hopeful coasting on her brother's reputation. And that morning, before the SEALs arrived, before Commander Dalton Rourke froze at the sight of the tattoo, she tried to ignore Brown and his friends joking that she probably got her ink at a mall kiosk between lattes, because keeping silent had always been safer than feeding the fire. But something felt different in the air, as if the training grounds themselves held their breath. And when the hum of incoming rotor blades pushed a wave of warm wind across the field, Harper straightened instinctively, sensing change the way animals sensed approaching storms. And the moment Commander Rourke stepped out, scarred jaw, mid-40s, posture carved from stone, Harper felt a prickle run down her spine, not of fear, but of recognition without memory. The strange tug that sometimes happens when your life brushes against a truth it isn't ready to reveal. Rourke began evaluating candidates with the indifference of a man who had seen too much to be impressed by anything, pacing down the rows like a predator sorting prey from potential. And when he stopped abruptly and asked Harper why she always kept her sleeve rolled down, the trainees behind her choked back laughter, certain she was about to embarrass herself. But Harper, tired of the assumptions and the small cruelties, tired of swallowing her fire until it smothered her, lifted her arm and pushed her sleeve up, exposing the black and crimson trident coiled with a serpent, lines sharp, old-world styled, unmistakable to those who knew what it meant. And those who didn't know fell silent anyway, because Rourke had gone utterly still, eyes widening just a fraction. The way someone reacts not to surprise, but to recognition they never expected to see again. He stepped closer, voice dropping low enough only she could hear, asking who gave her the mark, and when she answered, "My brother, sir," the air around them seemed to solidify, heavy with questions no one dared ask. But before Rourke could speak again, another SEAL approached and murmured something Harper couldn't catch, something that made Rourke's jaw tighten and his gaze flicked back to her tattoo, as if recalibrating the entire world around him. He dismissed the rest of the candidates with a curt order and motion for Harper to follow, leaving Brown and the others gawking after them. And as she stepped into the shade of the operations tent, Harper couldn't shake the sensation that she had just crossed a threshold she didn't know existed, one that someone had planned for her long before she was born, because miles away, in a locked federal archive, a clerk was opening an old military file containing a photograph of a much younger Commander Rourke, a classified insignia matching Harper's tattoo, and a sealed addendum referencing a dying man's last request: "Find the girl with the serpent. She's the last link to what we lost." And though she didn't know it yet, Harper Lane was about to learn that her tattoo wasn't a symbol of belonging. It was a warning, a debt, and a door. Harper stepped deeper into the operations tent, the canvas flaps falling shut behind her with a soft thud that sounded more like a warning than a door closing, and instantly the world outside, voices, wind, rotor wash, blurred into a dull vibration, leaving only the sterile hum of generators and the faint tick of someone's wristwatch as several SEALs paused mid-task to study her with expressions that were neither curious nor dismissive, but something closer to wary recognition, as if they were seeing a ghost slip into their midst. Harper felt the weight of their stares gathering on her shoulder where her sleeve now rested halfway up her arm, exposing the black and crimson trident coiled with a serpent, the tattoo she had spent years keeping hidden. And though she refused to show it, an uneasy pressure tightened in her chest because she could tell that none of these men were surprised by the symbol itself, only by the person wearing it. Commander Rourke didn't speak for several seconds, simply circled the metal table in the center of the tent with a gait that carried the heaviness of someone recalling old memories he never intended to revisit. And when he finally turned to her, there was no trace of the brusque authority she'd seen on the field earlier, only a grim, contemplative stillness that made Harper's skin prickle as though she were standing in the doorway of something enormous and dangerous without knowing how she'd gotten there. He asked, quietly but with razor precision, whether Nathan had ever told her the origins of the tattoo, whether he'd spoken of the men he'd served with before he was assigned to his last, more public unit, and Harper, still unnerved by the sudden shift in tone, shook her head, explaining that Nathan had always avoided discussing that period of his service, calling it the chapter that stays locked, a phrase she'd once assumed meant trauma or loss, but now sounded more like protocol, and Rourke exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand across his jaw as though steadying himself before unlocking a steel cabinet bolted to the tent frame. He withdrew a thin black folder that looked like it had been handled by gloved hands for decades, its edges worn, its label stripped off long ago, and he placed it on the table with deliberate care, urging Harper to open it. And although her fingers hesitated for a beat, curiosity and dread pressed her forward. The first thing she saw was a photograph, its colors faded but its details still sharp enough to sting. 6 operators standing in rugged terrain, geared in uniforms Harper didn't recognize, each wearing a variant of her tattoo high on their arms. But her breath caught when she noticed the figure half hidden in shadow at the end. Her brother, unmistakably Nathan, younger than she had ever seen him, younger than she had been when he'd given her that tattoo, and his expression in the image, hard, alert, coiled like a wire, was nothing like the patient, joking brother who'd taught her how to track footprints in soft earth. As she stared, Rourke explained that the photo wasn't supposed to exist, that the group in it had belonged to an experimental reconnaissance unit called Trident Coil, a covert collaboration between intelligence and special operations created to infiltrate hostile networks that conventional teams couldn't reach. And the secrecy surrounding them had been so absolute that their own families believed they were deployed with standard task forces, their true assignments buried beneath layers of misdirection. But something catastrophic had occurred in 2012, an operation gone wrong, a betrayal, a breach, Rourke wouldn't say, not because he didn't trust Harper, but because he claimed not even he was cleared to know the full details, and whatever had happened was severe enough that the unit had been quietly dissolved, its existence scrubbed from records, its operatives reassigned to unrelated positions or slipped into early retirement, as if the coil had never existed. Harper tried to reconcile this with the brother she knew, the steady presence who never once hinted at serving in a unit so secret it was practically myth. And when she asked what any of this had to do with her, Rourke hesitated long enough that she felt the answer before he gave it. He told her that the trident serpent mark wasn't decorative or symbolic. It was a code, a signal, a warning recognized only by those who had served in or against Trident Coil. And when Nathan inked it onto her arm, he had effectively tied her to a legacy he had spent years trying to outrun, marking her as kin to the coil in a way outsiders would understand instantly. And though Rourke didn't know why Nathan had passed the symbol to her, he suspected the reason could only be fear or urgency, because for the past month, 3 former coil operatives had vanished. Men who lived in different states, worked unrelated jobs, kept low profiles, and at first their disappearances looked voluntary. Paperwork filed cleanly, vehicles sold or given away. But when Their families reported unfamiliar SUVs parked across from their homes in the weeks before they vanished, and their financial records froze mid-transaction, as if someone else had seized control. Rourke and a handful of others began to doubt the official narrative. Harper felt a cold numbness spread through her limbs as she realized her brother must have known something was coming, must have sensed that whatever had destroyed the coil was circling back, and instead of distancing his family from it, he had branded her as the one thread certain people would watch, protect, or hunt. Before she could process this, one of Rourke's men burst into the tent, breath ragged, radio clenched in his fist, his face drained of color as he leaned beside the commander and whispered something that made Rourke stiffen like he'd been struck. Then, slowly, with an expression caught between fury and resignation, he turned to Harper and told her that her brother Nathan's file had just been flagged on a restricted channel, one that only handled emergencies tied to dormant Black-level programs, and 2 codenames had been attached: Black Echo and Priority Arclight. Terms Harper didn't understand, but Rourke clearly did, because his jaw tightened as if bracing for impact before he delivered the final line, the one that made the room tilt and the air feel too thin to breathe. Nathan Lane, missing. Presumed hostile capture. For a long, suspended moment after Commander Rourke uttered the words, Nathan Lane, missing. Presumed hostile capture, Harper felt the world tilt under her feet the way a storm ship tilts before capsizing. Yet instead of collapsing under the weight of it, a strange, fierce calm spilled through her. Slow, deliberate. The kind of calm a person feels when the truth they've sensed for years finally steps into the light and calls them by name. She didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't even blink, just stared at Rourke with the steady focus of someone who had survived enough doubt to no longer fear uncertainty. And Rourke, seeing that unexpected fire, softened his posture slightly before explaining that Black Echo was a code reserved for threats that lived outside the boundaries of governments. Organizations operating in the dark corners between competing intelligence networks, the kind of enemies who didn't want territory or headlines, but secrets, leverage, erasure, and Priority Arclight meant the threat wasn't merely adjacent to a ghost program like Trident Coil, it was directly tied to its collapse. Harper's breath hitched, more from recognition than shock, because she realized then that the tattoo Nathan gave her had never been a badge of pride. It had been a shield, a beacon, a hidden flare meant for men like Rourke, for eyes that would understand, and Rourke confirmed it when he revealed the final piece of the story. The elderly man who died alone in that forgotten room decades earlier was not some relic of the past, but the Coil's last logistics chief, the guardian of its members' identities and operational trails, and he had spent his final years haunted by the knowledge that one loose thread remained in the world, a young girl not yet born but destined to carry the last unbroken line of a unit meant to vanish. And on the day he died, he left behind metals no one could decipher and a letter addressed to a general that read only, "Protect the girl with the serpent. If she appears, the end is coming for all of us." Harper's legs felt hollow as Rourke continued, telling her the man's warning had been dismissed as the ramblings of someone losing his grip on time. But when Harper exposed her tattoo on the training field, that dormant warning roared back to life, and encrypted chatter began spiking across channels that had been silent for a decade. Messages from black market brokers, deep cover operatives, private contractors, all asking the same question. Who is the new bearer of the coil mark? That question alone was enough to confirm that Nathan hadn't disappeared randomly. He had been extracted with precision, taken by the same people who dismantled the coil, taken because he knew the girl existed, because he had marked her, hidden her in plain sight, and because someone out there wanted the last thread severed so the past could stay buried. The tent vibrated as rotors outside began spinning up again, the dull thunder shaking dust from the canvas roof, and Rourke stepped closer, lowering his voice to something equal parts warning and plea as he told Harper that he couldn't order her into what came next. She wasn't enlisted, wasn't read in, wasn't required to join a rescue mission that bordered on suicide, but the truth was written all over her face. She had never needed permission, only purpose, and losing her brother was all the purpose she would ever need. Without waiting for an official invitation, she zipped her jacket, tightened her boots, and moved toward the exit, as if every step were aligning her with the path she was born for. And Rourke, seeing the same unyielding resolve Nathan once carried, gave a single, heavy nod, telling her that the coil had fallen because someone underestimated the wrong set of quiet people. But perhaps, against all logic, it would rise again for the same reason. The night air hid her in a rush as she climbed into the helicopter, blades churning the earth into a cyclone around them. And as she gripped the side rail, feeling the vibration travel up her arm and settle beneath the tattoo that had started all of this, she understood the final truth of the narrator's warning. Stories don't end because people die. They end when the last person connected to them stops fighting. And Harper Lane, ash blonde hair whipping in the wind, heart pounding with fear and fury and love, was not finished. As the helicopter lifted off, leaving the base and the life she once knew shrinking below her, she stared into the darkness ahead, into the place where her brother had vanished, into the shadows that swallowed the coil, into the jaws of whatever hunted her family. And she whispered a promise carried on the roar of the rotors, a promise that felt like destiny sharpening its blade. I'm coming, Nathan. They should have never touched you, and they should have never underestimated me.